Okay, so we're live now with our very first Micro JC Summer Book Club discussion. This summer's theme for our book club is the Summer of Scientists. It's actually our fifth summer book club, so I'm really excited that I've managed to do this for 5 years running, and I've read, this is going to be, of course, now I'll have read 15 books over the summers for this, so that's pretty exciting too. And so we're on our first discussion, and we've got a couple of people here to talk about this book with us. So we'll do some introductions. My name is Laura Williams. I'm an assistant professor at Providence College in Providence, Rhode Island. And then next to me, I see Nicole. So I'll have Nicole go next.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nicole Scipio, and I'm a scientist at Concentric Agriculture Incorporated that is located in Montreal, Canada. And I am really excited to be back for another book club. I think this might be my third one with Micro JC, so I'm very happy to be here.
Yes, so we are glad to have you. And next to Nicole, I see Mike. So Mike, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Michael Davis. I'm a PhD student in microbial ecology at Baylor University. And I've been to Montreal once. I was there for the ISME 15 back in 2015. So yeah, that's cool. But yeah, my focus is on microbial ecology, on microbial communities in wastewater and wastewater treatment plants.
Excellent. That's an excellent area of study. I did a little bit of that in collaboration with a physics professor here, but there's clearly a whole very healthy literature about that. Yeah. And then next to Mike, we've got Lucy.
Hello, I'm Lucia McCullough. I'm a PhD candidate at UMass Dartmouth, and I'm currently studying microbial interactions. And yeah, that's it.
Okay, so this is our book that our group is going to discuss. It's Rosalind Franklin, The Dark Lady of DNA by Brenda Maddox. I thought that it might be kind of interesting because I was trying to think about when I first, could I remember the first time I was introduced to Rosalind Franklin as a figure who was significant in the discovery of the structure of DNA, and I could not remember. I couldn't remember if it was in biology undergraduate or if it was later than that. I actually couldn't remember when I was first kind of introduced to her story. And I didn't know, does anybody else remember? Do you actually remember when you first heard about her and her part in the discovery of the DNA structure? Mike does.
I do, yes, definitely. Yeah, because the a movie called The Life Story at the BBC also, and it was released in the USA on the A&E network as a Race for the Double Helix, and it came out in 87 or 88, and my mom had recorded it. So that was like my junior year, which turned out to be my last year actually of high school. Well, yeah. And I watched that many times, and it's a great, if you haven't seen it, it's actually on Vimeo. You can find it if you Google Life Story DNA.
Is it true that Jeff Goldblum plays
yes,
James Watson?
Jeff Goldblum is James Watson in probably his first nerdy scientist role, actually, or one of his early ones. And
that's great casting. That's really good casting, I think.
And I forget the actress's name who plays Rosalind, but she's really good too. And actually reading this book, and I look back at some clips from the movie, and I was like, wow, they did good. I think they did a good job at reflecting her frustrations and sort of the complex relationship, sort of the personalities and the backgrounds of people involved. So it's really good. If you haven't seen it, I would definitely recommend it. But that's the first time I can remember. I mean, they go through the whole story. From Watson first meeting Maurice Wilkins to the publication. So
yeah, I'll have to look into that. I think that's really, I didn't realize that they'd done like a whole, and that it was this detailed. So I'll have to see if I can find that, especially now that I've read this.
It's really good, yeah.
Nicole or Lucy, do you guys remember when you kind of first heard about Rosalind Franklin?
I kind of feel, okay, I'll go first. I actually had a genetics textbook in undergrad that was co-authored by Aaron Klug.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Nice.
So I remember photograph 51. I don't really know if there was a lecture where she was explicitly introduced, but I just remember that photo showing up again and again about, that evidence for helical structure. And then at some point, I'm sure on social media, I saw that photograph also like printed onto a sheet cake for some anniversary at Cold Spring Harbor. And I'm just like, I want a cake like that. But anyways, I've always sort of wanted to know more about her after I also recall reading something, and it must have been like an Encyclopedia of Women Scientists or something, that had mentioned that by the time she had her PhD, number one, she was in her early 20s, and number two, she had 5 papers on crystallographic structures of coal. And I just thought it was really interesting about the range of sample types that she got to work on in her career, and also just the general respect I have for physical and biophysical chemists, because the data they work up with is on such an abstract level, but gives you so much insight into like how things work and how things are built. So I just always kind of figured that someone that talented definitely deserves their story to be told.
Yeah, wow, that's neat that you had the textbook, because that this is skipping ahead to the end, but the epilogue of this book talks about the fact that Aaron Klug was one of Rosalind Franklin's main proponents as history was starting to be shaped by those who were still around, that he was a big part of making sure that she was remembered and acknowledging her. Lucy, you had some thoughts about when you first heard about her too.
I don't remember if I actually learned about her in undergrad, but I remember my first year of grad school being so disappointed when I learned that she didn't get the Nobel Prize. I was devastated when I learned about this.
Yeah, I actually, it's funny because this is a story that's now, it's been over 50 years now, but as you get to because this covers from her childhood through her scientific career and then her very early death, which is, I think, in her mid to late 30s. And when you get into the later chapter, and I was actually like kind of upset. Like this happened so long ago, but I was reading this and I'm like, oh, she's gone now. It's so sad. So I was amazed by how touched I got, even though this has been some time now. But I see we actually got Luke who popped in while we were chatting. Hi, Luke.
Hi.
Just as an introduction, we were kind of trying to recall the first time we might have heard about Rosalind Franklin. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that you might want to contribute.
I think it would have to be my second year genetics course. That I remember our prof talking about her, and again, kind of how she's a little bit forgotten in history and didn't really get the credit that she deserved.
Yeah, and I think I was kind of curious to hear that, because I think one of the interesting themes is that that this book addresses is trying in some way to kind of set the record straight about what her role was and who she was as a person. And so I thought maybe what we could do, the author, Brenda Maddox, has split the book into kind of 3 parts, where she deals with kind of, it's almost like Rosalind before King's College in DNA, Rosalind during King's College in DNA, and then Rosalind after King's College in DNA. So I thought maybe we could kind of structure it that way too, just as a way of kind of working our way through it. In the first part, one of the things that I thought was really neat about this is the fact that the author clearly spent a lot of time coordinating with the family in order to get access to Rosalind's personal letters. And so there's a lot of excerpts of her letters to her parents from when she was very young, and they sent her to boarding school, or they would ask her when they were on holidays, she was supposed to send letters to her family. So there's all these great letters from her as a child. And I thought to myself, wow, this is really fantastic to be able to see this person who becomes so significant, kind of what they were like as a kid. And I don't know, was there anything that particularly struck you guys about learning about her childhood, which is probably something that wasn't brought up very often if you did run across her in classes?
I just really like that she hated being photographed. I was I would like that. That's awesome. I can totally identify with that.
So take photographs of other things, but not
yeah,
yourself.
exactly. Yeah.
Lucy, did you have a thought on that too?
Yeah, it was really neat just learning about her, how her whole childhood was structured, and like the background of her family. And yeah, the fact that she would write letters for everything, like even into like later in life she was just like constantly writing her family letters and all of that stuff. I was like, wow, that's dedication.
I was kind of thinking that now I was kind of embarrassed because, like, gosh, if anybody needs to write a biography about anybody who's now doing all their work, it's just going to be like emoji, 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 LOL, emoji. And I'm like, maybe we should work on that. I don't know.
It's going to be the tweets.
Yeah, it's just going to be someone's like, yeah, they're going to just print out this. It will be this biography except pages of tweets.
We actually couldn't tell you anything about this person because they had a MySpace page and we can't find it anymore. It's just...
That's right. Here are all the Facebook groups they were involved with. Well, I think one of the things that she talks about, and she doesn't spend, it's interesting to me because she touches on this at the beginning, and it's a running thread through the book, but Rosalind Franklin and her family are Jewish. And she talks about being as part of a affluent Jewish family in England, when England has some very particular class structures, and then there's also some very particular attitudes towards Jewish people. And it's interesting because a few times later in the book, she mentions that it was very clear to people that she was kind of from the upper class, but it wasn't necessarily clear to people that she was Jewish, possibly because her name Franklin doesn't automatically signal to people that she might be Jewish. But the author kind of, I liked that she seemed very careful about trying to make a hypothesis about how much that shaped how she interacted with people. But there was definitely an element of considering how her upbringing as an affluent person, but then also as a Jewish person, might have impacted how she interacted with people and how she viewed her position in society. I don't know if anybody had any if that struck anybody else too.
I'm not sure if I actually knew that before. I can't remember if I didn't know that or I knew it and forgot. You know, I may have read it somewhere and just forgotten, but that really struck me that, oh, I didn't realize it, or I'd forgotten that she was Jewish. And what struck me was, you know, it was right. She was going to school during World War II, and all this was going on, and that stuff kind of is not mentioned. Yeah, I mean, I guess her younger life is not mentioned much in other biographies, but just that. Besides, I mean, her primary struggle, I think, later in life was being a woman in science and the male-oriented institutions, but you know that struggle with anti-Semitism was there too. And also, I found it really interesting some of her letters to her dad about her faith or lack thereof, and her family is starting to get really. You know, her grandmother died and wanted her family to be really conservative and only marry Jews, other people of Jewish families, and all this, and that struck me. Growing up in a pretty conservative Christian family, so I mean, just that kind of struggle between conservative religious thought and how that can be sometimes anti-science, not necessarily, but you know, and so that struck a resonant chord with me anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I was also struck by how important family was, and at least the way it seemed to be put up forth in the book was that was because they were Jewish, that being dedicated to the family was like such a huge thing, and like she was always hosting them, and like no matter what, like family always came first, even when she like had that discussion with her dad about like her faith not necessarily being that or as important to her as science, it sounded like to me.
I loved all her feisty letters with her dad. Like it seemed pretty clear that they enjoyed arguing with each other. But I think that was a good glimpse of how how her kind of personality was coming forward even when she was young, that she was like, it's like this, it's like this, and it's like this. And you think this, and that's fine, but that's not how it is. So, you know, like, yep, that's a good way to go when you're kind of going to try to argue something later on in life that might seem controversial.
I like that they point out how that argumentativeness that she learned from her dad and from talking to her dad, like, would get her in trouble down the road, while it was not really like any kind of barrier for him in his career and life.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
To your to your point, I remember thinking because there's that part where they vacationed in, I think it was Norway, like, and it was just at the beginning of World War II and the Holocaust, and she talked about how they got the second boat out of Norway back to England, and it just made me think a lot about, like, say that didn't happen and they didn't catch that second boat, and like they had been caught by the Germans or whatever, like her contributions would have been lost, right? And it just made me think about, like, and not that like human loss on its own is a loss just in and of itself, regardless of what those people contribute to society, but like how many other ideas and achievements were lost in that time. You know what I mean? Like,
oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was a pretty devastating in many ways. There's a lot of things you can point to and be like, what would have happened? Where would these people have ended up, or what would they have contributed? This is also, and I've encountered this in other books too, but it's always an amazing, as someone who's born and raised in the United States, it's always amazing to me to read about, from the English perspective, because that's where they were living during World War II, of the bombing of London, and just how intensely London was getting bombed. And if you meet British people of a particular age, that's still a very formative part of how they think about life, is, you know, we were under siege, basically, just constantly getting bombed. And I think the family moved around a little bit in trying to find areas that were a little more protected, or trying to get them out of target zones and things like that. And lots of families in England were thinking about that. That's a pretty formative time to kind of come of age and think about who you are as a person, especially as a woman. And so she goes to school, and she goes to St. Paul's, which is, there's a paragraph that kind of talks about her experience at school. And then she goes through, I really liked, again, because they have her letters, they've got all of her thoughts about when she's taking her exams. And I'm not particularly familiar with the British system, but I understand that there's like a set of, you take various sets of exams, you have to sit for these exams. And she sits for these exams in like chemistry and physics and all these topics that are very complex and intense. And every time she's done, she's always like, oh, it's terrible, it's the worst, it's so bad, I failed, I suck, it's awful. And then it's like, first in her class. Like, you thought, there it is. Yep, that happens to a lot of us. Not that we get the first in the class afterwards, but and I thought, gosh, I meant to go back and mark it, but there was a point at which it was talking about, I don't know if anybody else remembers, but in her schooling, she actually had a couple lectures, I think, on X-ray crystallography. And there were a couple of lectures maybe on DNA, and it mentioned somewhere that in one of her notebooks and kind of the marginalia, she was like, is it a helix? So, like, even when she was in college. But I couldn't manage to find the page. I should have just marked it.
On page 56, there's...
Ah, did you find it?
I think so.
Oh, yeah.
She wrote Geometrical Basis for Inheritance.
There it is. Yeah, there it is. Yes. So it's got, yes, she's talking about nucleic acids in her notebooks. And it says a sketch in her workbook represents a helical structure. She made a note to herself, Geometrical Basis for Inheritance. Thanks, Mike. And I thought, oh, that's cool. It also made me a little bit, it kind of made me think too, like, I definitely was not doing intensive X-ray crystallography in my undergraduate education. I was a little behind where she was. That's okay.
Can I mention real quick on that?
Oh yeah.
It's something that I thought was along those lines, that on the next page it shows some of her notes. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. A crystal physics class she took, and like I never, I took introductory physics, and it was two courses or three, yeah, 2 courses, and that's as far as I got. And I took a little bit more chemistry, but that was just way beyond what I got to as an undergrad too. So
yeah, me too. And I think these are the types. So this is I think what you're mentioning. And I assume these are the types of content, the types of topics that she was sitting for her exams. This is the kind of thing they would have drilled her on. So she definitely knew her stuff, which is pretty impressive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, as I reflect on this, I kind of feel like we need to talk about Rosalind Franklin more in secondary school and junior public school. So I mean, there's the whole question of environments for women who go into the technical professions, which is another debate in and of itself, but to see somebody who embraced it so enthusiastically and managed to have a balanced life around doing it, because all of that postgraduate existence of hers was, working really hard and coupled with really good allocations of time for family and vacation. Like,
yeah,
it was actually really nice to see that whole picture, but I was also just really liking her deliberateness as an adolescent, going like, not with the botany courses right now. I just want my math and my physics so I can have what I need.
That's right. That's right.
Like she had this stuff like kind of figured out,
Yeah. She's very clearly a talented and brilliant person. I mean, that's
and
evident.
deliberate. I mean, like the whole goal setting thing, it was just, it was embodied within her. And I don't know where that comes from. I suspect having that strong family cohesion and like a parent like her father who challenged her intellectually through discourse, I feel like a lot of that probably feeds a person to get a mind that functions in that way. Like there's probably some larger environmental factors there, but I mean, just the way that she was calculating how to get to where she needed, I think is just exceptional, as a quality to have as a person.
And I kind of wondered if the fact that she was a daughter in that family actually ended up working in her favor. Because all her brothers, it was the way they described the family was that, well, the dad was very involved with education, but also primarily they were kind of involved in investments and banking and so forth. And then they had a publishing house. And so the sons were basically like, well, you're obviously going to do the banking, except for the one son who's like, I don't really want to do that. He's like, okay, go to the publishing house. You can work there. So I wonder if she'd been a son, if they would have just kind of like tried to shove her into like, these are the family businesses, go into them. Because she was a daughter, they were like, no, just do whatever, it's fine. She's like, off I go, physics and chemistry.
I don't know. I mean, she did bicycle from Paris back to London, so I think she would have done whatever she wanted.
That's probably true.
I just feel like she had that attitude, like that drive, that I don't think she would have been dragged into the family business without a whole lot of yelling, to be honest.
That's true. That's true. So she, when she completes her education, and I don't know if I'm skipping over something, but I was going to talk about her kind of first set of work pre-DNA, which actually happened in France. And I did not know that she became one of the world's leading experts on the structure of coal and which forms of coal will turn into graphite upon heating and which will not. And that was a lot of her early work with kind of X-ray crystallography and thinking about structures. So there's that aspect of it from the scientific perspective. But then also, I thought it was interesting that the book kind of, that sounded like a very happy time for her. And she was in Paris. The author does some discussion about what were probably very stark cultural differences for someone at that time, England versus France, in terms of how much people embraced her in terms of what seemed to be where she was employed, kind of a lack of strict hierarchy, that she seemed to really kind of really embrace kind of what the author keeps calling like a European lifestyle. And it made me happy for her on the one hand, because it sounds like she was very professionally and personally fulfilled living there. But then, of course, if she hadn't moved back, we wouldn't have had all her work on DNA structure. But I don't know. It was interesting to me because I think maybe all of us can, unless we're very fortunate, all of us can kind of think of a time when we were in a situation that we were like, this is not the best person I could be in this situation. This is not doing it. And so I think that ends up contributing even more to what happens at King's College, because she was coming there from someplace that she really felt like, this is so fantastic and I love it here. And everything in Paris is great.
Mm-hmm.
My research group is great. All the people are great. Life is great. I feel like that was probably a contributing factor to what made it so hard.
The movie that I mentioned earlier, the Life Story, A Race for the Double Helix, that definitely gives you that impression too. If you watch that, she's there's a scene where she's at a pastry shop, a coffee shop with all her colleagues, and they're just laughing and joking and have a good time. Everybody knows each other, and then she gets to England. She doesn't know anybody. Everyone's kind of, and it's dark and raining, and it had always been sunny and good weather in France. But yeah, it definitely gives you that impression that just as you say, she was a lot happier. The social structure was more open. I didn't really know how much she had been an expert in coal. I didn't realize that either. I knew she had done a lot of work, and there's a book called the Path of the Double Helix, which is more of a technical scientific history of crystallography, and which I have somewhere. I can't say I read it all, but it is interesting because it talks about Asbury and his work at Leeds, which they mentioned, and he eventually did work on some DNA too. And it's like her career kind of took the same path, and carbon and coal, graphite molecules, and eventually to DNA. So I'm with you. I was absolutely thinking how, she didn't say, she was very clear on her goals. She had like such a drive. She would have succeeded anywhere, but we're so lucky that she just ended up where she did, just so she could contribute. Because I mean, she didn't set out saying, okay, I'm going to work on DNA. She was wherever she was going to find work to do her stuff. So.
Yeah, I thought it was like incredible how much of an expert she was at the whole coal thing, where like years later she's still getting invited to these conferences and stuff. So like she got invited to the Gordon conference in the US, and I think that's also like what why she went to like Eastern Europe for a bit. I forget what the conference was. And yeah, she also like you said, she like loved the culture so much. They talk about how they always used to like go out to lunch together, and then how they would like go back and have like coffee that they brewed in laboratory flasks. And I'm like, guys, no.
Don't do that. Next, you're gonna be mouth pipetting. Stop.
But they like emphasize it in the way that they have like all these like really intellectual discussions and all these things, which obviously like she loved to argue, so she probably loved that kind of stuff. And yeah, it sounds like it was a really good time in her life, and she also got lots of publications from it.
Yeah. It kind of, I don't know for you guys, but it kind of sound, at least the way the author described it, it sounded like the when people think they're going to become a professor, that sounded like the type of life they think they're going to have. They're like, we're going to go to lunch at the cafe at noon, and then we'll come back and have coffee and talk about such, and then we're going to do this. And then we'll do science and publish lots of papers. It'll be great.
Wait, you mean that's not how it is?
I'm so sorry, Mike. It's not.
Dang it.
Not now. No. Well, it was for her for a little bit, so maybe you just have to move to Europe. Maybe that's the key. But it really did sound like an amazing time for her.
Except for the little maybe romance thing that happened with her boss. They're very vague about it in the book.
How did you, I'm curious what you guys thought about that, because I think understandably, and it might be a response to her posthumous characterization as kind of a a dowdy man-hater, which apparently by this is not accurate at all. But it kind of, there's a theme that's kind of, it's not, the author doesn't hit you over the head with it, but there's this kind of running theme of like, why didn't she ever marry? Was she ever actually in love with anybody? It's pretty clear that of people who knew her, they don't agree. Because there's a couple footnotes where she'll say, well, Anne Sayre said this, and the Franklin family does not agree with that. They dispute that, So even within folks that knew her, they don't agree about how she felt for particular people.
I don't think it's super surprising that her family would say that she didn't feel that way. Because it also sounded like that's not something she talked about with them. But I think it's definitely possible that something would have happened and like she just wouldn't leave a record of it. She clearly like had strong feelings for her French boss. What was his name?
Marion, I think.
Yeah. But like whether or not anything happened, like I don't think we'll ever know.
I think I'm glad it wasn't a major theme of the book, because that would have made it seem a little I don't know. I don't know that I would have wanted a book that was like, did she ever date anyone? I don't know that that's the most important question about her life. But it did. I appreciated that the author was willing to kind of touch on that and say, like, this is supposed to be a portrait of her life. So we are going to kind of think a little bit about this. And I think the French boss actually shows up at the end when she's in the hospital and is apparently still very much close with her.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's important to highlight the relationships in her life, because that is a lot of what makes us human. And so I think it frames her in a certain way. What those relationships were, or some will never know, but like some of them were like clearly really good, or like that one at least started as a really good professional relationship where they were like intellectually so like well matched and she really liked him that way. And I think that's also a cool way to characterize how she was like, she was clearly a really good friend with the people that she really liked. She like would always host people and cook for them. And
that came through really clearly. Like she had some very deep friendships that lasted, her entire life, which I think is a testament to her ability to kind of be kind to people and care about people, which is also very clear in the book.
Yeah, they mentioned that one time she like let a friend who got like pregnant stay in her apartment, like just stay in my apartment. Like I'll put in like all the baby things here and there. And that's awesome. Like that's so generous.
I feel like this is a great book for somebody who's trying to decide if like how they should try to do work-life balance. Because I was when I was reading it, and it was like, and then she went on holiday for a month to Yugoslavia, and I was like, yeah, you do it that way. That's a great. I mean, she freaking discovered the structure of DNA. She went on holiday for a month. I'm gonna do that. That's the key. But I do like the fact that she was very much like, I shall tomorrow climb the Alps. And you're like, okay, all right.
Her vacations were incredible.
Yeah.
Like all that climbing and like trekking through everywhere. I was like, that sounds awesome. I want to go climb the Alps or all the other places that she went to. That some of them were probably kind of dangerous.
Like later in her life, she makes that trip to Israel, and she's like, I went out to a little town, and the only place to get anything to eat was a cave, and they had sardines. And you're like, what? Doesn't seem safe. Okay.
Different times.
Yes. But those were good details, because that, again, you're getting a much fuller picture of her as a person and what her interests were. And I truly think, just in terms of as we're kind of embarking on our careers, like there's always lots of demands put on people, but being able to step away can help your brain so much. Because if you're just beating away at something with you're trying to solve a problem. I mean, you guys have all, I'm sure, had this happen, where you're trying and trying and trying, and finally it's like, look, I just got to go home. And you come back to it the next morning, and within 5 minutes, you're like, oh, it's that. and then it's fixed because your brain has had a chance to actually think about something else. So that's valuable.
I along those lines, I really enjoyed reading about how she wrote to a friend right after. Well, I think it was Wilkins who asked her if she wanted to collaborate. She was really upset about that because basically everyone was using her data, using her pictures, and throwing out their ideas, And I think it was Wilkins who was talking about it, and she felt belittled by that, basically, by saying like I'm the one doing the good work and you guys are throwing out some ideas. So I can totally understand her point of view, but she really it really hurt her, and she wrote to her friend Adrienne that she came back to a crisis in the lab which lasted weeks and weeks, took all my energy, and she couldn't write anyone. You know, and so to me, I haven't had, obviously the same kind of experiences, but it makes you realize, wow, even these people that we sort of idolize as scientific heroes, they had their problems and they couldn't work for periods of time.
Mm-hmm.
So when we have that, it's like, that's just normal. That's human.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And again, I think that's the huge value in having access to her letters, because there would have been no other way to know like what was going on with her from a week-to-week basis like that. So, so she goes to France. France is magical, and then she decides. It's interesting. Kind of, there's some push and pull to get her back to England. The pull is the family. The push is that I think that the relationship with her boss is becoming a bit complicated. She definitely expresses a lot of regret about leaving France. She's very conflicted about it. And when she first comes over to England, it's on a fellowship to continue her studies of coal. And she's brought into King's College, London, by, I think it's J.T. Randall.
Mm-hmm.
J.T. Randall is the head of a big, I can't remember if that's the biophysics unit or if it's later, but he's the head of a big unit. And he's described in the book as basically collecting people. So he's somebody who likes, like, you're smart, you're smart, you're smart, you're smart, 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 all these smart people. But then he doesn't give them any guidance about what they should do. So anybody who's ever been, I was not in a large graduate lab, but I knew people who were as a postdoc or graduate student. So anybody who's ever been like in a large lab by a well-known person probably gets to that part and goes, oh, I know exactly what that's like. Because you've got these poor people who are all really smart and really driven and really don't understand who's supposed to be doing what. What belongs to who, and are we duplicating each other's work? Are we supposed to be working together? And it sounds like you hate to think, and this is a thing that we always tell students, we're always like, there's never just one turning moment that shapes everything. But it kind of sounds like in this case that there was, because it seems like Randall brought her in, sent her a letter that basically said, why don't you stop working on coal and start working on nucleic acids? Because you've got this guy Wilkins and this other guy Gosling, and they've got some cool data, and you could do some X-ray crystallography, and that would be great. And when she shows up, Wilkins is on vacation. And so they miss this opportunity to actually connect at the beginning and have a conversation about, I'm doing this, how about you do this? Maybe we'll check in with each other this way. And it seems like maybe had they had that opportunity, it still wouldn't have worked out, but not having that opportunity just sent them basically on what seems like a collision course. They're almost destined to never get along because of that initial formative moment, which Randall really dropped the ball.
Yeah.
I found. Oh, sorry. I actually have to run in a couple minutes here anyway, but I found, and so the last, as far as I got in the book, was where she wrote that death notice for the helical structure of what was it, alpha DNA.
Yeah.
And I actually found this part of the book a little awkward to read, because I think a lot of it wasn't from her letters anymore. It was from Watson and Crick and people she had these kind of combative relationships with. And I think you could definitely, or at least I felt you could feel bias, because you're just getting their side of the argument, right? You're not getting hers. And there was one part in particular where, and it wasn't a quote, it was the author's words, and I'm like, oh, I think you're getting maybe a little influenced by some of these interviews. And it was on page 161, and what did they say? Oh, it's at the top of the page, the end of the first paragraph, and the prank sent her into another tantrum, and she called them all little schoolboys. Tantrum is maybe a regrettable word selection to use when describing an adult human.
Yeah.
So yeah, I was finding, and I think the author, I think she had a difficult task trying to parse out the truth from all these guys that she was talking to. But I was just like, oh, this feels a little weird to read. I don't know if anyone else felt that.
I didn't pick up on that specifically with that moment, but at some point earlier, I forget where, the author does describe her as pretty in a certain way, and that kind of seems strange too, because here she was kind of criticizing folks for judging her on looks, and kind of talk, and I think you're right, she has a difficult job of explaining the story at the same time being objective. But then the author at some point says, and she was quite pretty at this time. I thought, well, that's great, and she was, I'm sure she was, yeah, but it just sounded odd to come, it just sounded like you're going back into that mode of how we describe people, which is hard not to do, I guess. But
I feel like there's in some places where the author is pushing back against prevailing notions that we aren't familiar with anymore. I think this was when was this written? This was in 2002, was at least, yeah, so the hardcover edition was 2002. So 2000 and 2001 would have had all of the retrospectives about, and I kind of remember this, the retrospectives about what happened in the 20th century for science.
Yeah.
The discovery of DNA structure would have been a big part of it.
2003 would have been the 50th year, was the 50th year, yeah.
Yeah, I actually remember that James Watson came to my college. I graduated from college in 2001, so he came to my college in one of my last years to give a talk. He was not invited by the biology department. He was invited by the administration. The biology department was furious because they were like, we don't like it. We don't want it. And I know this is going out on YouTube, but everybody knows this. He proceeded to make a fool of himself. So this is not a new thing for Jim Watson, unfortunately. But I wonder if she was writing this because the criticisms that the characterization of Rosalind Franklin was that she was dowdy, that she was, that this, and she talks about it. It's like she's kind of this harpyish person. And I wonder if in some places the author is trying to kind of introduce a new characterization where it's like, no, she was a vivacious person. She was friendly. She was sparkly. People loved her. It reads funny, but I wonder if there's a conversation she's having with stuff that we're not aware of now, because that's not how we think about her now.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. This has been a really good discussion. I have to leave, but
sure. Thanks for coming for it. Yeah.
I'm sad that I have to go right at this part because I think it's getting good. But
yeah,
enjoy the rest of it, guys.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. Lucy, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, some of Watson's characterization was also like, oh, she'd be pretty if only she knew how to dress and put on some makeup, and so yeah, she I think she's responding to that probably.
Mm-hmm.
The being like, no, she was normal, attractive human who actually liked clothes and things. So this is a completely unfair characterization. That's a really interesting time that she had to write about, though, too, because I think it was also clear to me, I think that she didn't like working there, and so it's emphasized there. And so I wonder if not every single description of her at that time was unfair. She probably would have been unpleasant to work with if she was really depressed and felt like she really didn't belong there. Whereas or she like sounded really cranky because, she felt like her work was being taken away from her and that kind of thing. I think a lot of where those descriptions lead is very unfair. But certainly being like, oh, she wasn't fun to work with at the time, like, is probably true.
I feel like this whole, I was reading this about her experience, and like the point that I think it was Luke who brought up the quote about the prank sent her into another tantrum, and that the wording he was saying, that was questionable wording. What that sentence is talking about is that the people in her lab were basically trying to tease her. And so it said, once when she had covered some apparatus in the lab with blackout cloth, she came back to find the sign Rosie's Parlor. Remember, she does not want to be called Rosie. Rosie's Parlor hung on it. This hint of the gypsy, the alien, and the occult shows the swart associations that Rosalind stirred at King's. Like, I'd kind of pissed too if people were doing stuff like that, And I felt like that this section to me was a really great example of why all our conversations about inclusivity now are so important.
Yeah.
Because part of why she was so miserable was because that was a perfect environment for one type of person, and she was not that person.
Yeah.
She was not male. She was not Anglo, because she was Jewish. So she was English, but she was Jewish. And she was not willing to kind of go along with the like almost frat boy kind of mentality that the author describes. And because of that, she was miserable. And Lucy, you made this point, and I could tell you that, I mean, there were times when I was in graduate school that if you were writing a biography of me, there were people who would be like, she is a really nice person. Because there were times in graduate school when I felt very insecure about what I was doing. I had no idea if everything was going to work. And it kind of makes you like sit at your desk and go, and people, if they come talk to you. I really read this and thought, this is why you have to think about inclusivity. This is why you can't. There's a couple of mentions of like end of year holiday parties where they do cute things, like come up with little songs that about, Rosie this and da da da. And you're like, yeah, I'd be super frustrated. I would not be happy.
I hate to keep bringing up that movie again and again.
Oh yeah.
But I mean, it's so good. You should watch it. But it does show a little bit of, there's a couple of different parties that it is shown there. And it seems like people are just, flirting with everyone else. I mean, the culture was quite different, especially for the guys. I mean, like Frank Crick shows basically flirting with this girl, and you don't know how open his relationship is with his wife. It makes you wonder that. But it's like, yeah, if you wouldn't feel comfortable there, you wouldn't be comfortable with that kind of party. I don't think I would be. And then her friend Vittorio visits from France, and she shows him like I want to call it a smoking room, but it's like just a room,
like a lounge.
A lounge, yeah. A lounge, but it's for men only.
Yeah,
no women. So, and she shows them that, and she says like I wanted to show you this, that it's not just me. I'm not making this up. This is how hard it is.
Yeah.
And and I don't know if now's a good time to bring it up since we're talking about this, or save it for later. But yesterday, did anybody catch Francis Collins interviewed on NPR? So, head of the NIH, there just came out a report about problems with inclusivity in the NIH. And Francis Collins, I think, probably as a response to, I'm sure he knew this report was coming out. So this might be partly I'm not saying it's just a move to make himself look better, but he did come out and say that he wants to follow up on this, and he agrees that there's a problem and that it needs to be looked into. But he says he's not going to be on any more panels at scientific meetings if there seems to be a bias, if there's just all men, and he knows that there's women that should be on the panel too. So I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah. I did know about the all-male panel thing, that they've been making a push to not appear on panels that are all men. Yeah.
So he said, he came out publicly, he made the statement, however, he did this press release, these interviews, and he said, yes, he's decided that he would, from now on, if meetings ask him, because he's the head of the NIH, he big part in the human, he's asked to be on these panels quite a lot. So he said he's gonna refuse unless they're
Yeah.
allowed,
And I mean, and you see that with her work. She was often, in a lot of this book, she was one of the only women mentioned. I think the author does a good job of trying to point out places where she encountered other women scientists. Another one of the books that was suggested that I'm probably going to try to find is about Dorothy Hodgkin.
Yeah.
And Dorothy Hodgkin comes into here a couple of times.
Yeah.
And I, for whatever reason, just did not occur to me that the two of them would have interacted. And so when I saw them, and then she had a conversation with Dorothy Hodgkin. I was like, oh.
So I just want to say one more thing about narrative voice in the King's College section of the book. And I think for Luke's comment and for the fact that the author does not present King's College for all the reasons that you stated in a charitable light. There's a drinking culture. It's misogynist as hell. There's no project management. There's nobody really giving a damn about projects being cannibalized by the rightful owner. That I kind of wonder if some of that creeped into the author's writing about emotional responses from Rosalind, because it had now shifted the gaze to be that of the ethos of King's College instead of, I mean, I'm not trying to defend it as a misassignment. It's really hard to make these transitions between Be Curated to King's College to Birkbeck, because they all show very different consequences for somebody who has a strong need for an environment that supports a high quality of work, and for somebody who wants to be within a community of practice. And clearly that wasn't there in King's College.
Yeah.
I was thinking, I think you're right on track. I was thinking that exact thing. I'm glad you were able to point it out, because it's like it's from their point of view.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. This is also a really good testament to the importance of, like Nicole, like you said, good management, which is not a skill that those folks who go on to become PIs get in their training. But my goodness, it can either make a team work or it can destroy a team.
A conversation as simple as when would be the right time to deploy model building in that research question?
Right.
Why wasn't that even a thing that people decided they should talk about? And what were the intersections of personnel going to look like in that discourse? Because Rosalind did get to a point where she thought, okay, I'm good for building a model now. And I mean, it's different it's been different for a while because of what we do with computers to build models, because we have curations of databases for intermolecular interaction, but that wasn't a thing.
No. You're buying when they eventually built their model later on, when she gets to Birkbeck, she moves on and they do tobacco mosaic virus. The guy, one of her trainees, one of the people working with her, was like, I just ran down to the bike shop and bought a bunch of bicycle handlebar grips and made a little virus out of it.
I mean, I was humbled by that whole, I'm doing my Patterson mapping calculations by hand thing. Like, I'm just like, no, I would have just dropped out of my PhD by then. I'm sorry. No.
If she got into a time machine and came out now, she'd probably be like, you guys are so soft.
Exactly.
Can't do this by hand. Come on. So she does. It's interesting because she leaves King's. She wants to go, and so she ends up moving to Birkbeck, which is still in London, but as a different college within the university system. So I think how it worked. But at that time, she's already taken photograph 51, which I have to tell you guys that every time I see the name Gosling, it does not help that his name is Ray Gosling, because I always want to say Ryan Gosling, and Ryan Gosling's definitely not involved, as far as I know, in X-ray crystallography. Apologies to Mr. Ryan Gosling if that's his hobby. So I was like, especially when we were having this discussion, I was really afraid I was going to be like, and Ryan Gosling took the but she had already taken all the photographs, and when she leaves King's to go to Birkbeck, J.T. Randall, the head of her department, writes her this really ridiculous letter that essentially tells her, don't think about nucleic acids anymore.
Yeah.
What? I mean, meanwhile, one of the people under him, Maurice Wilkins, is like carting over data to show to these two competitors that came at you know, where they were at Cambridge, like, hey guys, there's this cool stuff we done, and I don't know, do you guys want to take a look at it? And there's a moment at which, like, Wilkins, they say, like, and then Wilkins realized that perhaps he had overstepped. Like,
Yeah, that whole section, I was just so angry reading it. Actually, any mention of Watson and his, like, attitude towards her, I was
Watson.
just like, just so angry that whole time. But yeah, like, Wilkins and his, like, oh yeah, let's be chums. You're definitely not going to scoop me or anything, right? Come on, dude.
You know, and meanwhile, like, Linus Pauling had at some point, I think, written Randall and been like, hey, why don't you show us some of your data? And Randall knew enough to be like, hell no, man. No, we're not doing that.
Yeah.
But I knew this already before reading this book, but I always liked the story that Linus Pauling published the incorrect structure in, I think it was PNAS. And you know, I mean, Linus Pauling is a giant in his field, but even he got it really, really wrong. You know, apparently so wrong that anybody, like, with a decent chemistry background looked at the structure and went, no. You're like, how did that happen? But so I don't know if anyone wants to offer any other thoughts about her time at King's, but I was going to kind of talk a little bit about her time at Birkbeck and how everything ended up kind of playing out. Good? Okay. So she moves to Birkbeck, and I actually am happy that she was not still at King's. I'm happy that she, as a narrative, which is, you know, this is a person's life, so you're not supposed to kind of want narrative structure to things, but this kind of third act, as the way the author has presented it, seemed to me to capture more of what made her happy back in Paris, because she had a team. She had a team of people who seemed to really get along and really enjoy working with her and really value her expertise. And even after her death, some time after her death, it sounds like they were still very impressed with her and what she taught them. And it sounds like I think there were 3 at one point where she kind of basically had PhD students or trainees or folks. And there was one person who I guess she didn't get along with and it didn't work out well. But there were 3 that kind of formed this little core unit with her. And it really sounded like they were very cohesive and worked really well together. And so for me, kind of reading how and imagining how painful it must have been to be dealing with everything at King's, I was glad that she kind of ended up in an institutional environment that was a lot better for her happiness. And it's a little sad to think that you can see where she was going. She would have, you know, been in charge of the unit, and she would have, you know, trained many people, and she would have gained prominence beyond what she's gained now. You can see where she was going with that.
I think it also helped that her supervisor was a lot better at forming teams and delegating and all of these things.
Yes.
But yeah, her, like, that environment sounded like so ideal to her, and they published so much from that group. I was like, it was like 7 papers a year or something. I'm like, what?
I'm like desperately working on manuscript revisions for something that I submitted like back in the fall, and they're like pumping out papers. Like, okay.
And at one point they're like, oh, you probably shouldn't publish too much in Nature. Just publish it to the active crystallographic. Like, what?
That's a nice problem to have.
Yeah, very different times.
I'm just like, yes, please go publish somewhere relevant. Like, I just not, please go publish somewhere high impact. Like, that's just such a refreshing piece of the past that needs to come back. Like, can we bring back relevant domain publishing into the fashionable forefront? I'm good with that.
Yeah.
Also cute was her whole tour to America. It's like, we're friends, right? Send me viruses. That was kind of awesome. Like, the whole, she was good at building collaboration, and she knew what she had to get. Like,
Oh, definitely.
yeah.
I did think it was interesting. There was a discussion where, and I'm going to say his name wrong, but when she started working on tobacco mosaic virus, she sent a draft of a manuscript to somebody who was big in the field.
Curie or something?
Yes, thank you. Yeah. Yep, so Curie. And
I don't know if that's how you say it either.
I don't know. So he was a British virologist, and they just got off on the wrong foot with that. Yeah. Because she had data that suggested a couple of things that he did not believe were true. She turned out to be right. He turned out to be wrong. But it sounds like he was going to remain, as long as she was in tobacco mosaic virus research, it sounded like he was going to remain a thorn in her side. But he kind of inserted himself in a couple of discussions of who's going to get funding for what and da-da-da-da. And it, that's been happening a long time too. So that was interesting to see.
Slightly unethical.
Yeah, just a little, I feel like, and this is based on no data, but I kind of feel like that's probably was easier to happen previously because people felt like that was how it was supposed to be. Like if you were good, you would kind of rise to the top and then people would know you and then they could advocate for you. Mm-hmm. And now we're kind of like, it's not, I think it's a little, I think it's much less accepted that somebody just says, I know that guy, so you should give that guy that grant because he's cool. We had beers at Woods Hole. It was awesome. You're like, what? Who cares? I don't think it's perfect by any means, but it sounds like it was much more rampant, that it was just kind of a network of people who advocated for their favorites. Mm-hmm.
I'm sure it still depends on I'm sure if there's a group of people in a certain field and everybody knows each other so well that they're comfortable doing that, I wouldn't be surprised if that still happens from time to time.
That's true.
But I think if there's that professional, if they don't know each other that well, and there's a professional formality and distance that comes through mostly, that, okay, we're going to play by the rules.
Yeah.
We have to, because not everybody's going to is really part of my inner group. So
right. You'd hope people are more aware of that.
There's I guess that's an argument for not getting too chummy with everyone.
Because then you have no one to review anything. You're like, everybody knows me. So she spends time working on tobacco mosaic virus, and as Nicole already alluded to, she makes her grand tour of the United States, which I'm gonna make a broad sweeping generalization and say, typical of a lot of British people, she wildly underestimated how big the United States is. She's like, I'm just gonna hit it all, and you're like, yeah, no, don't do that. But she does it. She actually does give it a good go and spend some time in the East Coast. She ends up a little bit in the Midwest. Again, like back to her work with coal. So there are industrial folks that want to hear from her about coal and graphite. And then she ends up on the West Coast too, which she has kind of mixed experiences. Some places are great. Some places she finds, I can't remember what California institution she was just, it was
Berkeley.
A major virus lab. Lucy?
Berkeley?
I think it might have been Berkeley.
Yeah, I think both times that she was there, she says
she did not have good things to say. But it's also interesting because they've got her letters back to her family to hear her shifting viewpoint on Americans in America. And so it's always interesting to hear an outsider's perspective. But she comes away with a very positive impression of the U.S. and of her American colleagues. But then I think it's in her second trip back to the U.S. So I think she's only about 37 or so, where she starts to have pains in her abdomen. And the book really, her illness and her death are dealt with very quickly in the book. It sounds like it was very sudden. And I'm not positive if that's true, because by the time I got to that section, I wasn't keeping this good track of the timeline. But the book gives you the impression that she had pains in her second American trip, and then very quickly things just progressed, and she had some treatments that they thought might be successful, but in the end it had advanced too far, so she had ovarian cancer.
Sounds like it was less than 2 years from like when she first started.
Is that the timeline? Okay.
I think so, because I think when she leaves the US is August 1956.
Okay,
I think it's April 58 when she
got
finally
it. Okay, so that's a little longer than I had come away with the impression of. But
yeah,
still,
it still seemed to go by very fast.
still quick. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And and I think I already mentioned, I think at the beginning of our chat, that when it gets to the chapters that are talking about how her health kind of degraded and in her eventual passing, I got really like affected by it. You know, there's this discussion of her continuing to try to work, and she's kind of crawling up the stairs from the X-ray lab in the basement up to her office at the top floor. And I don't know if this is actually how it happened, but the author makes it sound like her group is like next to her, like, will you just let us carry you up the stairs? And she's like, no, I'm going to do it myself. So she was a pretty determined and driven person up until the end, is what that makes it sound like.
It sounds like maybe the first year she did okay after they removed the 2 lumps, and it was like after that it started to like she like could no longer like go into work very much and stuff. But she's amazing. She secured them funding from the NIH to set them up for the next 3 years, and then like also set them up for like after that to move to Cambridge, I think.
Yes, yeah. And she bequeathed part of her estate to Aaron Clegg, who was trying to figure out what he was going to do. Part of her work as the head of her unit had been always trying to advocate for funding for him specifically, because his position was a bit precarious, and he had a family, and he was thinking, according to the book, he was thinking about moving back, I think, to South Africa. And she was doing everything in her power to secure him funding. But when she died, she had written specifically in her will that he was to receive like a sizable amount of money. And according to him, he's like, that was it. That was what meant I could stay. And he ended up winning his own Nobel Prize and being president of the Royal Society. You know, you're like, oh, wow.
Yeah.
The end of this book was really like, got very dusty in my house at the end of it.
The obituaries really got me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I definitely started tearing up a fair bit during that.
Yeah, I mean, you could, and it was useful to see that, because you could see people who knew her professionally, but also personally, the esteem with which they held her. You know, they knew that she was a high quality scientist. And so that's why it makes it extra frustrating that Watson in particular, and even as the book mentions, even a little bit Crick, were defensive to the point of wildly mischaracterizing her as a person and a scientist. And so I think that's something that they did wrong.
Oh, absolutely.
And they know they did, I think, and I think it's...
Yeah, she speculates that it comes from a place of guilt for both of them. I thought what was really interesting too is like after the whole DNA thing came out, they became her collaborators, and even like a little bit with Crick, like friends.
Yeah.
And they never told her. That's wild.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good point.
It kind of makes you wonder what would have happened if she had lived.
Oh yeah.
What would that? The epilogue of this book is really interesting, because I feel like it's the first time that the author. I feel like the author was. We talked a little bit about narrative voice, but overall, I feel like the author was very cautious not to overinterpret in the main text of the book. I think she was definitely addressing some preconceived notions, and there were things that she felt were mischaracterizations that she wanted to take head on. But in the epilogue, the author allows herself a little more latitude to provide some of her own perspective on what she thinks in terms of the major questions that people ask, which is, did Watson and Crick steal data? Would Rosalind Franklin have been awarded the Nobel Prize? You know, she kind of takes a couple of these very common questions and just gives her perspective. And I think her perspective on did Watson and Crick steal data is, yeah, 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 they did.
Well, I also like that she's addressed the whole, was the demeanor of Rosalind Franklin as portrayed in the Double Helix done to advance the sales of that book? And I'm glad that she moves to probing with a spoon to sort of stabbing with a fork rhetorically a bit more here, because you typecast a colleague to get more sales of your book. I mean, if that was the motivation, it's not, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I have no words for it because it's just kind of extremely irritating, to put it lightly, to think about that.
Well, and it's interesting.
Like,
it's interesting too, because she discusses that. So when Watson wrote the Double Helix, he was a Harvard professor at the time. So it was originally going to be published by Harvard University Press. And Harvard University Press said, as a condition of publishing this, we're going to contact all of the people who are significantly mentioned and ask them if they object to their portrayals. And every single one of them did. So Crick objected, Wilkins objected, like every person they contacted was like, no, this is not right. You cannot publish this. This is wrong. And so he ended up getting it published somewhere else. And, Rosalind Franklin was not around, but her brother, who ended up doing publishing instead of banking, apparently sent this furious letter that was like, how dare you publish this? This is an unfair characterization of my sister, and so forth. So, I mean, lots of people have talked about Watson. There's a lot you could say about Watson. I think part of Watson's gift, part of Watson's problem is his imagination. I think he's an imaginative person, and I think that helps him in his science, and I think he's an imaginative person, and I think that means that a lot of what he narrates about his time is fantastical. That's what I think.
I'm torn between wondering if it's good that he wrote just what he felt, like his point of view, no matter how bad it was, so that we have that on record, that's his, you know what I mean? I mean, no, obviously I'm not, like, I don't want to try to defend his characterizations, but at the same time, if that's really how he was feeling about people, it's kind of interesting that we have that perspective.
I think for me, I see what you're saying, and I think for me, I think part of it is him, but then part of it is us and how we receive it.
Yeah.
So when it was written, and when it was presented, and when it was advertised and marketed, it was presented as an authoritative account from a scientist and a professor of what happened.
Yeah.
So if you wanted to couch it as, here is an interesting study into one person's first-person perspective, with all of their flaws and foibles, with all of the bias that comes with who they are, here is an account from that person, that'd be one thing. But when you present it as like an authoritative account of what happened, then you're like, okay, wait a minute.
on the back of this, I have an old paperback, and it does say a book by a scientist about scientists. So it is portrayed, you're right, as kind of authoritative. This is how, this is accurate. This is honest. This is truthful. Yeah.
Right. I mean, he was originally going to call it Honest Jim.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Interesting.
But I also thought that one of the questions that gets tossed around a lot is, would Rosalind Franklin have won the Nobel Prize? And I like the fact that the author basically said, look, this is a pointless question to ask. I mean, first of all, she was dead, and they don't award them posthumously. But even if she was alive, it very likely would have been Wilkins. And then she kind of pivots from that question to what I thought was I actually wanted to screen cap some of her text, what I thought was a beautiful, precise, pithy takedown of the Nobel Prize itself. So if any of you didn't make it to the epilogue, you should just read it just for that, because it's like 2 paragraphs that are basically just like, the Nobel Prize is dopey. And you're like, no, that's true. So she kind of takes the question of should Rosalind Franklin have won the Nobel Prize, and turns it into, should anyone be awarded the Nobel Prize? Does the Nobel Prize even have a point? And I thought, yeah, that's probably a better question.
Oh, I mean, for me, it's more like, look at this person who did not get handed the best cards for longevity because they moved through 3 experimental systems in the time they had on this earth and did excellent work in all 3 fields. And probably some of that advocacy that happened at the end of her life must have come from a deep understanding of the precarity of having an academic career. I mean, there's a deep place of empathy when you read about some of the places that she's lived in. And I don't know, the Nobel Prize is really peripheral to me in terms of somebody who was capable of doing extremely good work in the field they had chosen, and also doing extremely good service work in the communities that they were in when those communities allowed that to happen.
Mm.
So, yeah.
Well,
yeah.
No, that was great, Nicole. I was actually thinking that's a really good summary to end on, because I just looked up at the clock and I actually lost track of time. So I apologize to everybody. I usually try to keep people to an hour.
Wow.
So I know, yeah. So sorry for running a little bit over. I know people's schedules are tight, even though it's summer. But does anybody have any, Nicole, I thought that was great. So I was kind of like, oh man, that's perfect. But does anybody have any concluding thoughts that you want to offer for the book? No, Nicole did it.
Nicole did it.
Nicole, you did. No, Nicole, that was perfect. Good timing too. So thanks, you guys. This was a really great discussion, and I was super looking forward to it. So I was very glad that you were all able to make it. Our next book is Pathfinders, The Golden Age of Arabic Science by Jim Al-Khalili. It's a little bit hard to find. So if you are interested in joining us for our next hangout, which will happen at the beginning of August, you can go to the website to see the date, and we'll probably try to do it at about the same time. If you're interested in reading that, which I'm really excited about because I know this much about Arabic science, I suggest you, if you're a library user, you might want to try to interlibrary loan it, or I had to order it through Amazon from not even Amazon itself, like a bookseller through Amazon, kind of a used books thing. So it's a little tough to get a hold of, but I'm hoping it's going to be worth it. So I think it's an interesting topic. So until then, hope everybody has a good July, and thanks again for joining us for this.
Thank you.